In the quiet suburb of Maplewood Heights, life unfolded like a predictable yet comforting novel. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns, colorful flower beds, and houses that seemed to whisper stories of happy families within. Neighbors exchanged warm smiles over white picket fences. Children laughed as they chased each other on bikes, and weekends often ended with barbecues or community potlucks. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, at least by face, and where disputes rarely escalated beyond friendly disagreements. But beneath this picture-perfect surface lay a simmering tension, one fueled by rules, regulations, and the ever-watchful eye of the Homeowners Association, HOA. The HOA meetings, held monthly in the community center's small conference room, were notorious for their monotony. Discussions about mailbox colors, holiday decorations, and acceptable fence heights dominated the agenda. Most residents attended these gatherings out of obligation rather than enthusiasm, nodding politely while stifling yawns. Yet, there was one person who thrived in this environment: Karen. Karen was not just any member of the HOA. She was its self-appointed leader, the unofficial queen bee of Maplewood Heights. With her perfectly styled hair, clipboard perpetually tucked under her arm, and an uncanny ability to quote every line of the HOA handbook, Karen ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves. She claimed her strict adherence to the rules stemmed from a desire to maintain property values and foster harmony among neighbors. However, many suspected her true motivation was control, a need to assert authority over every blade of grass and shade of paint in the subdivision. Enter Greg, a newcomer to the neighborhood who had recently purchased a cozy 3-bedroom house on Elm Street. A mild-mannered IT specialist in his early 30s, Greg had spent most of his adult life living in cramped city apartments. Moving to Maplewood Heights marked a significant change for him, a chance to escape the noise and chaos of urban life and embrace the tranquility of suburban living. At first glance, he appeared to be the ideal neighbor, polite, hardworking, and eager to fit in. But what Greg didn't realize was that his arrival coincided with Karen's latest crusade, one that would soon turn his peaceful existence upside down. It all began on a sunny afternoon when Greg was unpacking boxes in his living room. There was a knock at the door, and when he opened it, he found Karen standing there, clipboard in hand and a smile plastered across her face. Her demeanor was friendly enough, but there was something calculating in her eyes that made Greg uneasy. "Hi, Greg," she said cheerfully. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I hope you're settling in well." Greg nodded cautiously. "Thanks, Karen. It's been great so far." "Wonderful," Karen replied, flipping through the pages on her clipboard. "I'm sure you've heard about our wonderful HOA. We're always looking for ways to improve the quality of life here in Maplewood Heights." She paused dramatically before continuing. "Which brings me to why I'm here today. You see, we've been working on a project to enhance Wi-Fi coverage throughout the community. It's crucial, especially during emergencies when reliable internet access can make all the difference." Greg furrowed his brow. "Wi-Fi coverage? What does that have to do with me?" Karen leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting from casual to persuasive. "Well, your house has the perfect roof line, high enough to provide excellent signal range without obstructing views. We'd like to install a Wi-Fi extender on your roof. It'll benefit the entire neighborhood, including you." The request caught Greg off guard. He hadn't expected such a proposition so soon after moving in. I don't know," he stammered. "Won't that involve drilling holes or something? And what about my privacy?" Karen waved away his concerns with practiced ease. "Oh, nothing invasive, I assure you. Our contractors are professionals. As for privacy, rest assured, the extender will only boost public signals, not interfere with your personal network. Besides," she added with a sly grin, "it's for the greater good. Think about how useful it could be during storms or power outages." Despite his reservations, Greg found himself wavering. Karen had a way of making people feel guilty for questioning her ideas. She painted herself as the voice of reason, someone who cared deeply about the community's welfare. And truthfully, Greg didn't want to start off on the wrong foot with his new neighbors. Reluctantly, he agreed to let them proceed, though a nagging sense of unease lingered in the back of his mind. Little did Greg know, this decision would set off a chain of events that would test his patience, challenge his principles, and ultimately force him to confront the darker side of suburban life. For now, however, he simply watched as Karen scribbled notes on her clipboard, thanked him effusively, and walked away, leaving behind a faint scent of lavender perfume and an ominous feeling that things were about to get complicated. The next few days passed in a blur for Greg as he tried to settle into his new routine. He spent his mornings setting up his home office, afternoons exploring the neighborhood, and evenings unpacking boxes that still littered his living room. For a brief moment, life felt peaceful, almost idyllic, but that peace was short-lived. On the third day after Karen's visit, a white van pulled up in front of Greg's house early in the morning. Out stepped two men in matching uniforms carrying toolboxes and ladders. They didn't knock or announce themselves. Instead, they marched straight to the side of the house and began unloading equipment. Greg, who had been sipping coffee in the kitchen, heard the commotion and rushed outside. "Excuse me," he called out, trying to keep his tone polite despite the growing irritation bubbling inside him. "What are you doing?" One of the men glanced over his shoulder, barely pausing in his work. "We're here to install the Wi-Fi extender," he said matter-of-factly, as though this explained everything. Greg blinked. "Wait, no one told me you'd be coming today. Did Karen send you?" The worker nodded absently, already climbing the ladder propped against the side of the house. "Yeah, she arranged it. Don't worry, we'll be quick." Before Greg could protest further, the second man joined his colleague on the roof. Within minutes, the sound of drilling filled the air, followed by loud bangs and the occasional scrape of metal against shingles. Greg stood there dumbfounded, watching as the workers transformed his once pristine roof into what looked like a construction site. His initial unease quickly morphed into outright frustration. By midday, the installation was complete, or at least that's what the workers claimed before packing up their tools and driving away without so much as a goodbye. Left behind was a mess. Dents in the gutter, scratches along the siding, and a small but noticeable crack in one of the roof tiles. Worst of all, Greg noticed water dripping from the ceiling in his attic later that evening. Apparently, the careless drilling had compromised the roof's integrity, allowing rainwater to seep through. Fuming, Greg picked up his phone and dialed Karen's number. After several rings, she answered, her voice sugary sweet. "Hi, Greg. How's everything going? I trust the installation went smoothly." "Smoothly?" Greg repeated, struggling to keep his temper in check. "Karen, your contractors turned my roof into a disaster zone. There's damage everywhere, and now my attic is leaking. This isn't acceptable." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. When Karen spoke again, her tone had shifted slightly, less syrupy, more defensive. "Oh dear, I'm sure it's not as bad as it seems. These things happen sometimes. I'll have someone come by to fix the leak tomorrow." "That's not the point," Greg snapped, his patience wearing thin. "You didn't even ask permission before sending those guys over, and now my property is damaged because of your project. Why should I have to deal with this?" Karen sighed audibly as if Greg were being unreasonable. "Greg, please try to understand. This extender benefits the entire community. Yes, there may be some minor inconveniences along the way, but think about the bigger picture. Reliable Wi-Fi coverage is essential for everyone's safety and convenience." Her words hit a nerve. Greg couldn't believe how dismissive she sounded, as though his concerns were trivial compared to her grand vision of neighborhood connectivity. "Safety and convenience?" he shot back. "Karen, this isn't about safety. It's about you forcing your agenda onto everyone else. My house isn't some public utility station for you to exploit whenever you feel like it." Karen's voice hardened. "I wouldn't call it exploitation, Greg. It's called cooperation. If you don't want to cooperate, maybe you should reconsider whether Maplewood Heights is the right place for you." The implication stung. Was she really threatening to make him leave the neighborhood over this? Greg clenched his jaw, biting back a retort. Arguing further would only escalate the situation, and he wasn't ready to burn bridges just yet. Instead, he muttered a terse goodbye and hung up, feeling more frustrated than ever. Over the next few days, Greg attempted to focus on repairing the damage caused by the installation. He hired a local handyman to patch the roof and stop the leak, which cost him several $100s, a sum Karen had conveniently failed to offer reimbursement for. Meanwhile, the Wi-Fi extender hummed quietly on his rooftop, its presence a constant reminder of the ordeal he'd endured. At first, Greg thought the worst was behind him. Surely, having the device operational would bring an end to Karen's interference in his life. But he soon discovered that the real trouble was only beginning. One evening, while trying to stream a movie online, Greg noticed his internet connection lagging inexplicably. Pages took forever to load, videos buffered endlessly, and even simple tasks like checking email became infuriatingly slow. At first, he assumed it was a temporary issue with his service provider. But when the problem persisted for days, he decided to investigate further. Using diagnostic tools from his IT background, Greg analyzed his network activity. What he found shocked him. Dozens of unfamiliar devices were connected to his router, smartphones, tablets, laptops, even smart home appliances belonging to his neighbors. It seemed Karen hadn't limited the extender's reach to public signals as she'd promised. Instead, she'd effectively hijacked bandwidth from every household within range, funneling it through Greg's network. The result? His internet. Speed had plummeted to a crawl, making it nearly impossible to work from home or enjoy basic online activities. Enraged, Greg stormed over to Karen's house the following morning. He rang the doorbell repeatedly until she finally answered, looking mildly annoyed. "Greg, what is it now?" she asked, folding her arms across her chest. "This," Greg said, holding up his phone to show her the list of unauthorized connections. "Your precious extender is leeching off my internet. Look at this. Half the neighborhood is using my bandwidth without permission." "Is this what you meant by cooperation?" Karen glanced at the screen, her expression unreadable. "Well, I suppose that's an unintended side effect," she admitted coolly. "But honestly, Greg, it's not a big deal. Everyone shares resources in a community. You should be happy to contribute." "Not a big deal?" Greg echoed incredulously. "Karen, this is theft. You can't just steal people's internet and expect them to grin and bear it. And why is my network bearing the brunt of it? Shouldn't you be footing the bill for this operation instead of dumping the burden on me?" Karen shrugged, clearly unbothered by his outrage. "If you're so concerned, maybe you should upgrade your plan. Or better yet, join us in celebrating the improved connectivity throughout the neighborhood. Isn't that worth a little sacrifice?" Greg stared at her speechless. Her casual disregard for his grievances was maddening. She truly believed her actions were justified, that her vision of a hyper-connected suburb trumped individual rights and property boundaries. In that moment, Greg realized something important. Reasoning with Karen was futile. She saw herself as infallible, untouchable, and above reproach. If he wanted justice, or at least relief, he'd have to take matters into his own hands. He walked back home fuming silently. A thought began to form in Greg's mind. Karen might think she was untouchable, but what if he could turn her prized extender against her? The idea was risky, perhaps even reckless, but it planted a seed of rebellion deep within him. For the first time since moving to Maplewood Heights, Greg felt a spark of defiance, and the faintest glimmer of hope that he could reclaim control over his own life. Greg's frustration reached a boiling point as the days dragged on. The constant lag in his internet connection made working from home nearly impossible, and even simple tasks like sending emails or attending virtual meetings became exercises in patience. His once reliable home network had turned into a sluggish mess, all thanks to Karen's Wi-Fi extender, siphoning off his bandwidth for the entire neighborhood. Every time he tried to explain the situation to Karen or other neighbors, he was met with dismissive shrugs or outright denial. It seemed no one cared about the inconvenience they were causing him, except Greg himself. Determined to find a solution, Greg decided to escalate the issue to the HOA board. Surely they would see reason and intervene on his behalf. After all, the HOA existed to mediate disputes and ensure fairness among residents, right? With this hope in mind, Greg drafted a formal complaint outlining the problems. the unauthorized use of his property, the damage to his roof, and the ongoing strain on his internet service. He emailed the document to the board members and requested an emergency meeting to discuss the matter. When the day of the meeting arrived, Greg walked into the community center feeling a mix of optimism and trepidation. The room was small but tidy, with rows of folding chairs arranged in a semicircle around a long table where the HOA board members sat. Karen, predictably, occupied the center seat, her clipboard resting prominently in front of her. As Greg took his place at the back of the room, he couldn't help but notice the subtle glances exchanged between Karen and some of the other board members. Something about their body language suggested they already knew what he was going to say and weren't particularly eager to hear it. The meeting began with routine updates on upcoming events and minor rule changes, but Greg barely paid attention. His focus was entirely on the moment when his complaint would come up for discussion. Finally, after what felt like hours, the chairperson, a soft-spoken older man named Mr. Thompson, cleared his throat and addressed the room. "We have a concern raised by one of our newer residents, Greg Miller. He has submitted a formal complaint regarding the recent installation of the community Wi-Fi extender. Let's give him a chance to speak." Greg stood up, clutching his notes tightly. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and began explaining his grievances in detail. He described the unexpected arrival of contractors, the damage done to his roof, and the subsequent invasion of his internet bandwidth. He emphasized that he had never given explicit permission for any of these actions, and that Karen had misled him about the project's scope and impact. To drive his point home, he displayed screenshots showing dozens of unfamiliar devices connected to his network, each one draining precious resources. As Greg spoke, the room fell silent. Some board members nodded sympathetically, while others scribbled notes on their papers. But Karen remained impassive, her lips pressed into a thin line. When Greg finished, Mr. Thompson turned to her. "Karen, do you have anything to add?" Without missing a beat, Karen leaned forward, adopting her trademark tone of calm authority. "Of course I understand Greg's concerns," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "However, I must remind everyone that this initiative was undertaken for the greater good of the community. Reliable Wi-Fi coverage is essential, especially during emergencies. Yes, there may have been some minor hiccups along the way, but nothing that can't be resolved with cooperation." She paused, glancing around the room before continuing. "As for the alleged damage to Greg's property, I assure you we are taking steps to address it. And regarding the bandwidth issue, well, let's not forget that sharing resources is part of living in a close-knit neighborhood. Perhaps Greg could consider upgrading his internet plan to accommodate the increased demand." Her words hung in the air, eliciting murmurs of agreement from a few board members. Greg clenched his fists, struggling to contain his anger. How could they side with her so easily? Didn't they see how blatantly she was twisting the facts? Before Greg could respond, another neighbor chimed in. "Actually, my connection dropped last night too," said Mrs. Peterson, a middle-aged woman who lived 2 doors down. "I thought it might have been an outage, but if Greg's having issues too, maybe the extender isn't working properly." This comment sparked a ripple of murmurs throughout the room. Other neighbors began sharing similar experiences, recounting moments when their smart devices failed to connect or streaming services froze mid-use. For the first time, doubts about Karen's project started to surface. Even Mr. Thompson looked uneasy as he scanned the growing list of complaints. Sensing the tide turning against her, Karen quickly shifted tactics. "It's clear there are still some kinks to work out," she admitted reluctantly. "But rather than abandoning the project altogether, why don't we focus on finding solutions? Maybe we need better equipment or additional extenders to distribute the load more evenly." Her suggestion was met with hesitant nods, but Greg wasn't fooled. This was classic Karen, deflecting blame and proposing half measures to avoid accountability. He realized then that appealing to the HOA wouldn't solve his problem. If anything, it only highlighted how deeply entrenched Karen's influence was within the organization. The board members, whether out of fear or apathy, seemed unwilling to challenge her directly. Frustrated and disillusioned, Greg sank back into his chair, knowing he'd have to take matters into his own hands. That night, unable to sleep, Greg sat at his computer, scrolling through online forums in search of answers. He typed keywords like Wi-Fi interference, signal hijacking, and neighborhood disputes into search engines, hoping to find advice from others who had faced similar situations. Most threads offered generic tips about changing passwords or contacting ISPs, none of which applied to his predicament. Then, buried deep in a tech enthusiast forum, he stumbled upon something intriguing: a DIY guide for modifying routers to disrupt wireless signals. At first, Greg hesitated. The idea of tampering with someone else's equipment, even Karen's, felt wrong. Not to mention, interfering with wireless communications could potentially violate federal laws. But the more he read, the more intrigued he became. What if he could turn Karen's prized extender into a tool for teaching her a lesson? If she valued connectivity so much, why not show her what life was like without it? The guide outlined a relatively simple process for converting a standard router into a signal jammer. By tweaking certain settings and installing custom firmware, the device could intermittently block Wi-Fi signals within a limited radius. Importantly, the disruption wouldn't cause permanent damage. It would merely create temporary outages, forcing users to reconnect manually. To Greg, this seemed like the perfect compromise, a way to retaliate without crossing ethical boundaries. Over the next few days, Greg threw himself into the project. Using spare parts salvaged from old electronics and tools borrowed from his handyman friend, he carefully dismantled the extender mounted on his roof. Inside, he found a surprisingly sophisticated piece of hardware, far more advanced than the cheap routers he was used to tinkering with. Undeterred, Greg followed the instructions step by step, uploading new firmware and configuring the device to emit periodic bursts of interference. As he worked, a mix of emotions swirled inside him. Part of him felt guilty for stooping to Karen's level, for resorting to sabotage instead of seeking a peaceful resolution. But another part, the part that had endured weeks of frustration and disrespect, relished the thought of finally getting back at her. If Karen wanted to play dirty, then fine. He'd meet her on her own terms. By the time Greg finished his modifications, dawn was breaking over Maplewood Heights. Exhausted but exhilarated, he tested the device one last time before climbing down from the roof. Everything seemed to be functioning as intended. Now came the hard part, waiting to see how Karen and the rest of the neighborhood would react. Little did Greg know, his plan was about to unleash chaos far beyond what he had anticipated. The morning after Greg finished modifying the Wi-Fi extender, he woke up with a mix of excitement and nerves. He had spent hours perfecting the device, ensuring it wouldn't cause permanent damage, but would still deliver the message he wanted to send. The jammer was designed to intermittently disrupt wireless signals within a limited radius, just enough to inconvenience Karen and her overly connected neighbors without drawing suspicion from outsiders. Still, as he sipped his coffee and stared out the window at the quiet street, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing with fire. He decided to wait until late afternoon before activating the device. By then, most people would be home, settling into their routines, streaming shows, browsing social media, or using smart appliances. It was the perfect time to strike, not too early to raise alarms, but late enough to maximize frustration. As the clock ticked closer to 4 p.m., Greg's heart raced. He flipped through the instructions one last time, double-checking every detail. When the moment finally came, he took a deep breath, flicked the hidden switch in his attic, and braced himself for whatever happened next. Within minutes, chaos erupted. Karen was the first to notice something was wrong. She had been lounging in her living room, scrolling through her phone while waiting for dinner to cook in her smart oven. Suddenly, her screen froze, displaying an error message about lost connectivity. Confused, she tapped the screen repeatedly, hoping it was just a glitch. But when her smart speaker failed to respond to voice commands and her security camera feed went dark, panic set in. "What's going on?" she muttered under her breath, rushing to her router. Her fingers flew across the keypad as she tried restarting the device, unplugging cables and resetting settings. Nothing worked. Frustrated, she grabbed her phone and stormed outside, shouting, loud enough for the entire block to hear. "Is anyone else having internet issues? This is ridiculous." Her outburst drew immediate attention. Neighbors who had been enjoying their evenings quickly realized they were experiencing similar problems. Smart TVs froze mid-episode, video games disconnected players mid-match, and even basic web browsing became impossible. Parents scrambled to entertain restless children whose tablets refused to load cartoons. Some residents blamed their internet service provider, frantically calling customer support lines only to learn there were no reported outages in the area. Others suspected faulty equipment or power surges, unplugging and replugging devices in a futile attempt to restore connectivity. As the commotion spread, Greg watched from the safety of his living room, peeking through the blinds like a kid spying on a snowball fight. At first, he felt a guilty twinge seeing how much trouble his actions were causing. After all, not everyone in the neighborhood deserved this kind of inconvenience. Many of his neighbors were decent people caught in the crossfire of his feud with Karen. But then he spotted Karen pacing back and forth in her driveway, clutching her phone like a lifeline and yelling into it. That image erased any lingering remorse. Watching her squirm was oddly satisfying, a small victory in what had otherwise been a losing battle. By evening, the situation had escalated further. Dozens of residents gathered near Karen's house, forming an impromptu meeting to discuss the mysterious outage. Voices rose in frustration as theories circulated about what might have caused the disruption. Some blamed aging infrastructure, others speculated about hackers targeting the neighborhood. A few conspiracy-minded individuals suggested aliens or government experiments, earning skeptical looks from their peers. Karen, ever eager to take charge, positioned herself at the center of the group, clipboard in hand. "Listen, everyone," she announced, attempting to project authority despite her obvious distress. "Clearly, this is more than just a coincidence. Someone needs to investigate immediately. I'll contact the HOA board and see if we can arrange for technicians to come out tomorrow." Greg almost laughed aloud at her audacity. Here she was, orchestrating yet another dramatic scene over something she herself had created. If only they knew the truth, that the very device she championed was now wreaking havoc on their lives. He wondered how long it would take for someone to connect the dots. As the night wore on, tempers flared. One neighbor accused another of hogging bandwidth, sparking a heated argument. A teenager threw his gaming controller across the room in anger, narrowly missing his younger sibling. Even pets seemed affected, barking incessantly or whining as their automated feeders failed to dispense food. The once peaceful suburb of Maplewood Heights descended into disarray, all because of Greg's covert operation. But amidst the chaos, Greg noticed something unexpected. Pockets of camaraderie began to emerge. Strangers introduced themselves while commiserating over shared frustrations. Families stepped outside to enjoy the fresh air, rediscovering the simple pleasure of talking face-to-face instead of staring at screens. For a brief moment, the crisis brought people together in ways technology never could. Still, Greg knew the lull wouldn't last forever. Eventually, someone would trace the source of the interference back to him. And when that happened, he'd need to be prepared. The following morning, Greg woke up exhausted but exhilarated. His plan had worked far better than he'd anticipated, exposing cracks in Karen's carefully constructed facade. But as he sipped his coffee and scrolled through local news headlines on his phone, thankfully, cellular data remained unaffected. He couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind. How far was he willing to push this? Was revenge worth risking his reputation and possibly his place in the community? Before he could dwell too deeply on those questions, there was a knock at his door. Startled, Greg peered through the peephole and saw Karen standing there, flanked by two HOA representatives. Their expressions were grim, accusatory. Clearly, suspicions had already started to form. Greg's stomach churned. Whatever happened next, he realized, would determine whether his little experiment ended in triumph or disaster. When Greg opened the door to find Karen and two HOA representatives standing on his porch, his heart sank. The sight of them was like a spotlight shining directly on him, illuminating every misstep he'd taken since moving to Maplewood Heights. Karen's arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line that screamed accusation. Behind her, the two HOA members, Mr. Thompson, the soft-spoken chairperson, and Mrs. Lewis, a stern woman known for her love of rules, looked equally unimpressed. They weren't here for a friendly chat. "Greg," Karen began, her tone clipped and formal. "We need to talk about the recent internet disruptions in the neighborhood." Greg forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "Oh? What seems to be the problem?" Karen's eyes narrowed slightly as if she suspected sarcasm, but couldn't quite prove it. "Don't play dumb. You're aware that dozens of residents, including myself, have experienced sudden Wi-Fi outages over the past 24 hours. And guess what? Your house happens to be at the center of this anomaly." The word anomaly hung in the air, heavy with implication. Greg swallowed hard, trying to keep his expression neutral. "An anomaly? That sounds serious. Have you contacted the service provider? Maybe there's an issue with their equipment." Karen tilted her head, studying him intently. "Funny you should mention that. We did contact them, and they assured us there's no outage in our area. Which means the problem must be localized, and wouldn't you know it, your roof is home to the very device Karen installed to improve connectivity." Greg's stomach tightened. He had hoped Karen would assume the extender itself was malfunctioning, not immediately jump to the conclusion that someone had tampered with it. But Karen wasn't one to overlook details or potential scapegoats. Mrs. Lewis stepped forward, her voice sharp and businesslike. "Greg, we understand you've expressed concerns about the extender in the past. Is it possible you interfered with it? Perhaps unintentionally damaged it during an inspection?" Greg blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He hadn't expected them to accuse him outright so soon. "Me? Why would I do that? I'm just as frustrated as everyone else about the outages. Besides, I don't even know how to fix or break a Wi-Fi extender." Karen raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Really? Because according to our records, you work in IT. Fixing technical issues is practically your job." Greg clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to snap back. Of course, Karen would use his profession against him. She always found ways to twist facts to suit her narrative. "Yes, I work in IT," he replied evenly. "But that doesn't mean I go around sabotaging networking equipment. If anything, I'm probably the most qualified person here to help diagnose the issue, if you'd let me." Karen exchanged a glance with Mr. Thompson, who nodded thoughtfully. For a moment, Greg thought he might have dodged the bullet. Then, Karen spoke again, her tone colder than before. "We'll see about that. In the meantime, we're requesting permission to inspect your property, including the attic and roof. If the source of the interference is coming from your house, we need to address it immediately." Greg's mind raced. Allowing them inside meant risking discovery of the modifications he'd made to the extender. On the other hand, refusing would only fuel their suspicions, and likely make him look guilty. He needed a way to buy time, to deflect attention without incriminating himself. "I don't see why not," he said slowly, injecting a note of reluctant cooperation into his voice. "Hate giving up control of my own space, but if it helps resolve this mess, then fine. Just give me a minute to tidy up." Karen smirked triumphantly, clearly interpreting his hesitation as guilt. "Good. We'll wait." As Greg closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounded in his chest. He had bought himself a few precious minutes, but the clock was ticking. If Karen and the others discovered the jammer, there would be no denying his involvement. He needed a plan, and fast. Up. In the attic, Greg moved quickly, his hands trembling as he disconnected the hidden switch controlling the jammer. Without the interference active, the Wi-Fi signals would return to normal, hopefully throwing Karen off his trail. Next, he rummaged through a box of old electronics, pulling out random wires and circuit boards to scatter around the base of the extender. If anyone asked, he could claim he'd been tinkering with the device in an attempt to fix it, not sabotage it. Once the attic looked sufficiently chaotic, Greg descended the stairs and invited the group inside. Karen led the way, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors as she marched toward the ladder leading to the attic. Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Lewis followed closely behind, their expressions unreadable but undeniably judgmental. The inspection was tense. Karen examined the extender with exaggerated scrutiny, pointing out dents and scratches left over from the original installation. "Looks like it's seen better days," she remarked pointedly, glancing at Greg. "Any idea how it got this way?" Greg shrugged, feigning ignorance. "Maybe the contractors didn't handle it carefully enough when they installed it. Or maybe weather conditions took a toll. I'm not an expert." Mrs. Lewis frowned, clearly dissatisfied with his answer. "And what about all these loose wires? Were you trying to repair it yourself?" "Yes, actually," Greg admitted, allowing a hint of sheepishness to creep into his tone. "I figured I'd try troubleshooting since I have some experience with tech stuff. Obviously it didn't work, but I wasn't going to leave it broken without doing something." Karen shot him a skeptical look but didn't press further. Instead, she turned her attention back to the extender, testing its functionality with her phone. To Greg's relief, the signal appeared stable now that the jammer was inactive. Whatever suspicions she harbored, she couldn't find concrete evidence to support them. After what felt like an eternity, the group concluded their inspection and filed out of the house. Before leaving, Karen turned to Greg with a tight-lipped smile. "Well, everything seems to be working again for now, but if this happens again, we'll have to revisit the matter. And next time, we might not be so lenient." Greg nodded, forcing another strained smile. "Understood. Thanks for stopping by." As the trio walked away, Greg closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. He had narrowly avoided disaster, but he knew the reprieve was temporary. Karen wouldn't forget this incident, and she'd likely keep a closer eye on him and the extender from now on. That evening, Greg sat alone in his living room, staring at the ceiling where the attic hatch lay hidden. The weight of what he'd done and almost gotten caught doing pressed heavily on his shoulders. Yes, he had managed to teach Karen a lesson, exposing the flaws in her grand plans and forcing her to confront the consequences of her actions. But at what cost? His reputation in the neighborhood was already tenuous, and any further slip-ups could alienate him completely. Still, as much as he regretted the chaos he'd caused, part of him couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing Karen squirm. She had spent months steamrolling over his rights and manipulating the HOA to serve her agenda. Now, for the first time, she was on the defensive, questioning whether her projects truly benefited the community or merely inflated her ego. Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. He realized he couldn't keep playing cat and mouse games with Karen indefinitely. Sooner or later, they'd reach a breaking point. The question was, how could he turn this confrontation into a resolution that restored balance to his life, and maybe even to the neighborhood? For now, though, he decided to lie low. The jammer remained disconnected, tucked safely away in case he ever needed it again. And as he settled into bed that night, Greg allowed himself a small private victory. After weeks of frustration and powerlessness, he had finally struck back. Whether it was enough to change things for good remained to be seen, but for tonight it was enough to sleep soundly.